Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again. I'm here with the very cool Mr. Bob Smith once again, and we are talking about the another wonderful discovery in my life in this realm of esoterica in regards to Franz Bardon's first book, uh, Initiation into Hermetics.
Mhm.
So, first of all, welcome, Bob.
Welcome. Thank you once again for having me back.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you. And we our last video we talked about the third book, and uh, this first book is it's quite different in that it covers a wider range of exercises and capability training, I guess, is maybe one thing. And so, my first question to you, Bob, is and with your understanding, what is the purpose of initiation into Hermetics?
Okay, the purpose of initiation to Hermetics ultimately is to lead you into contact with divine providence, what we call non dual light, the nirvanic realms, the true Tao, what monotheists call God. Okay. To do that, most people need access to some technology. And IIH is a pretty good a pretty good grouping of skills that allow you to get there. You know, the, the reality is most cultures have room for one system like this. So the Tibetans have the six yogas of Naropa. The Hindu yogic guys in the subcontinent have the eight limbs of Patanjali, so on and so on and so on. The West, for some interesting historical developmental reasons, either lost theirs or the teaching of it got fragmented in such a way that it's not culturally accessible to most people. Because listen, you say, the word magic to most people, forget it. They're done with that conversation. You talk about meditation, okay, they're a little more open to that these days, but they automatically view that as through the lens of something that comes from Asia,
Mm.
not from their own culture. And so IIH, in terms of the internal power systems, it's probably the best source out there in book form right now. If you're interested in ritual magic, you'd be talking Circles of Power by John Michael Greer, which actually has a spiritual developmental path in there that's clearly outlined. Nobody does it. They're all interested in evocation and spirit magic, which, if you don't, like we said before, if you don't have your own Akasha and non-dual light, that runs down some interesting corridors. But ultimately, the purpose of IAH is union with the divine, as far as I can
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, after listening to many speakers talk about this, and you've even said, not it, only a small number of people have actually set out on this path with that purpose in mind. If anything, it's they had something they wanted to solve. And if you think about, what was the job of the classical wizard in the village, they were dealing with everything from making sure that people were going to be fed to
tell.
you know, uh, building things and making sure things happened and forecasting and all these types of things, but pattern recognition and such. But so, how does IIH prepare students for the remaining books, if you call it that?
If you're talking about working with the material in the book on evocation and the book on Kabbalah at a mental level, pretty well. Uh, where Bardon's book, and this is going to be taken badly by a bunch of people, but I'm going to say it anyway. Where Bardon's book falls apart is in the category of body training. Listen, when you grew up in the era where Bardon did as a kid, if you didn't have running water in the house and you wanted water, you had to go get a couple buckets and a stick, walk, a couple hundred meters down to the well, draw the water up and carry it back. So body training in that environment like that wasn't as big a priority because people were far more physical.
Hmm.
Given most of the people attracted to this kind of work today, that is not true. So you have to give them an avenue for body training in order for the energy to penetrate down deeply into the astral and into the vital and into the physical. Now, people who are successful at IIH tended to have already had that kind of training through another mechanism, whether that was martial arts, working in the woods, being a bricklayer, being in the military. And so for those people, Bardon's work functions just fine. For the other 95+% of the people, that's the sticking point in Bardon's book. It doesn't have adequate body training. The explanation of how to perform techniques is not in a modern bullet point format. So it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly what am I supposed to do here. And that's where the 60 skills curriculum came from. It was just taking all this technology and going, okay, this is how you actually perform it. Monkey see, monkey do. Um, those I would say are the two big sticking points with the first book. Now, another third sticking point that nobody wants to talk about is there's an odd phenomenon with esoteric works that when they get more than about 75 or 100 years old, they're not accessible to people in a modern era. There's been a big enough change in jargon or the language or culturally how things are explained that those sources are only useful to people who already know how to do it, but not to somebody coming into it. So a good example of this is you can go online and buy copies of the original Golden Dawn works, that were written in the early 1900s. They're very hard to understand. The language has changed just enough between the English of the time and English today that a lot of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So John Michael Greer released his book Circles of Power. So the way certain communities keep traditions alive, and why, again, this is going to be a controversial statement that's going to upset a whole lot of people. The works of Bardon are dying for this reason. The way traditions keep this alive, particularly, say, in Buddhism, is you'll have the base work, and then you'll issue commentaries.
Mm.
And the commentaries are written by a person from that age, and that keeps things alive. And they clearly know where the commentary is, who did it, and that keeps these things going. For very practical reasons, that will not happen with Bardon's work. Ray Del Sol issued a commentary on IIH a few years ago. He got sued. They're not willing to do that. And because of that, IIH will probably within the next 25 years not be accessible to a modern reader.
Hmm.
So if somebody doesn't go to the effort to write a new version of that, Bardon as a tradition will basically cease to exist. And nobody wants to hear this, and nobody wants to talk about this. But this is the history of magical teachers. These schools rise, they exist for a while, the information becomes inaccessible, they die off. Rinse, repeat. So that's going to get me a whole bunch of haters, more than I already have. But it needs to be said that the community needs to be beholden to the technology and what it can do for them, not to the idea of a lineage that belongs to a man that none of them ever met.
Hmm.
Listen, it would be another thing if this was like the school that Paracelsus, that Pythagoras had, okay, where he had known students who taught his system over and over and over and over again for about, I want to say it went on for about 300 or 400 years. In Bardon, we don't have that. Nobody knows who any of Bardon's senior students were. Nobody's ever met any of these people. Certainly nobody's learning from any of these people, or if they are, they're not telling anybody. So when I run into a lot of Bardonists, the first thing that comes to mind is you're utilizing the method, you're not a part of the school. Whatever school he had probably died in the 1960s in Eastern Europe someplace. And that statement is going to be upsetting to a lot of people, but it needs to be said that
Mm.
this is not a religion that you're following for religious reasons. This is a system of practical work. And so people really need to pay more attention to the methodology. And of course, they'll call me a dick, but I am one. So, I'm okay with that.
We look forward to your comments below, everybody. Now, I just want to say that in my own exploration of a certain other tradition, and I
Mhm.
won't mention it, there is so many different branches of it. But one thing that was pointed out to me was the value of seeking the underlying shared principles, the common denominators that we see across traditions.
Sure.
And, this universal approach has some real value in it. And, I wonder sometimes if this was the effort of Mr. Bardon was to present this universal approach and sort of share that. And
Right.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know. I mean, listen, Barden was a stage magician for a while.
yeah.
He was clearly comfortable with promoting himself. Unfortunately, he lived in a place, Czech Republic, in a time where, the socialists took over. They were under communist rule for a very long time. His ability to get out and about and promote himself and create a school was hamstrung by World War II and what happened in his local area afterwards.
Hmm.
So had he not been subject to those restrictions, he might have lived a lot longer and really created a much more vibrant school. But what little we do know about his personal practice was that his private practice group performed a lot more ritual magic than is contained in IIH.
Oh, interesting.
That was much more along the lines of what you see from grimoire work out of Western Europe. So I don't know. You know, again, the technology contained in IIH has been around a very and I say this all the time to the annoyance of many people. I have invented nothing. Neither has anyone else you've ever met because what we're doing here hasn't changed in 8,000 years. If you went back in time 3,000 years to ancient Egypt and sat down with an adept of these things, he would be showing you the exact same techniques.
Hmm.
One guy would know more, one guy would know less. Fine, that's the way things work. One guy would be stronger at it, one guy would be weaker. Fine, that's human nature. But the actual technology being employed is exactly the same. And so, yeah, there's room for a universal system out there without some real changes occurring governing how the works of Barden are being administered. This will die. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, this is, even just prompting this discussion, amongst the community and going, hey, this could be a real thing. We've seen evidence of this occurring in the past. Like there are cycles and seasons to things, and and part of this line of practice is we are essentially some ways custodians and stewards of this work, to maintain its existence. And I think too that just similarly, but off topic as well, it's like you know there's an intellectual capacity for understanding the information. Then when you do it, you become beholden to things that you can't really talk about chocolate if you've never tasted it, sort of thing,
Sure.
right? And so there's things that become self-evident, and I've got friends, skeptical friends, and they say, oh look, it kind of makes sense what you're talking about, but I'm like, well, you can't really speak about it if you haven't done it. You can't. What do they say over in New Zealand? Here we have a saying: you can't knock it till you tried it. Um,
Sure.
and yeah, so two topics at the same time there. But I think this is important, guys. Anyone out in the audience listening to this, have a think about like you're maneuvering through there's a legal landscape that needs to be brought into consideration. There's a legacy, and then there's the idea of like preserving and retranslating these teachings, the universality for a modern audience to keep basically true self development and perceptual capability development alive. because there's a lot of things working against that in the modern age, and
Right. And it's doubly handicapped by the fact that developing the sensitivity to work with these things takes time.
mm,
Sometimes a lot of time. And if people don't do that, it's easy to dismiss this stuff as not having an effect or not working at all. And that's where, again, physical training is so vital because it gives you the tissue and the connectivity to develop that sensitivity very rapidly. And I've used this example before is that very common thing to happen is you take a guy, comes out of a martial arts background, you learn some Qigong, he's really good at it, opens up a Qigong school, no, not a martial arts school, and he teaches and he goes, all my students suck, nobody can do any of this stuff. Well, the martial arts gave him the body training that gave him the sensitivity that allowed him to do the work.
mm,
But if he doesn't understand that, students aren't willing to do that work, what do you get? Oh, this is a mental or psychological phenomenon. Great. If you don't have any clairvoyance, you don't have any clairaudience, and you don't have any energy sensitivity, and you're doing evocation rituals, you can claim that. The second you have that sensitivity and you can see and hear and communicate with those things, the idea that they are a part of your mind goes out the window immediately
mm.
because now you know better. But you didn't have the sensitivity before, so you didn't know. It's the way it works.
And the dog agrees.
The dog agrees. Yeah. Sorry, guys, family.
That's great.
But it's where you'll run into examples of this are in things like shinging your 5 element fist, right? Okay. Color, sound, sensation associated with each fist. Do it 100,000 times. The guy doesn't need any sensitivity at all to make it work. So you can run into some of these guys, and they have a tremendous amount of subtle energy around them, but their ability to apply it is very limited. They have no finesse. And the same group of guys will go, oh, there's no such thing as chi. Well, there is, and they're interacting with it for an hour a day doing this, but he can't sense it. He has no ability to perceive it. And so that's where you can get into some trouble.
I just want to say that while we're on reasonably controversial and contentious topics, the various learning approaches to IIH. So we've got the classic linear sort of what Mr. Bardon puts in his book of saying do this, develop proficiency. Here's a basic metric, and then move on to this
Sure.
timelines, types of things, and then of course you have the holographic model, which is where you're basically doing a little bit of everything in
Mhm.
a sort of like a full system type of thing, a bit of this and a bit of that, and whatever else there may be out there too, where you may do a chunk and then just focus looping that chunk of say set step 1 to 3, roll that round a bit, move
Right.
along type of thing. So, what's your sort of thoughts on these different approaches?
All of those will work. Okay. The problem with quote unquote mastering a technique before you do the next one, that has a self defeating prophecy built into it. And that's the reason why the conversion of people who complete the book completely on their own, even though most of the technology is there, absent body training, is so low. Because what does mastering a technique mean anyway? Right? You can have a metric. Hey, do this for 10 minutes. Okay. Do it for 5 minutes. Fine. That's a measurable metric. But when you start applying unmeasurable metrics, mastery,
Mm,
that's going to make people self-sabotage and not want to move on to the next step.
mm,
The holographic method of doing this, or the method of doing a couple steps at a time and then moving on, tend to have a much higher success rate, assuming the individual goes back to do the techniques they weren't good at.
mm,
And this is the difference between an amateur and a professional. An amateur works on the stuff that he likes until he can do it. A professional works on the things he hates until he can't not do it.
Mm.
And so that's the problem with the holographic method is you make some progress, great, but you never get around to going back and fixing the things that you're not very good at. So there's room in the Bardon framework for people to be critical of people who skip ahead because a lot of those people never come back to finish up. What doesn't get said is all the techniques feed back into one another. So if you're not particularly good at one thing, working on another thing will make you better at it. You still have to come back and revisit things. That's also one of the things that is missing from the book that you would get in personal instruction, where step one, watching thoughts. I have to go back and revisit that about every 6 weeks. Why? Because my brain cup fills up again
Mm.
and I have to empty it out. So if I'm concerned with mastery, will I ever achieve mastery of that technique? No. I can achieve proficiency at it, which is really the goal. Okay. So yeah, no, there's room for criticism on both sides. That being said, you can easily get through the first book in about a year, year and a half, if you have the physical construction in your body to support the energetic work and the other things later on. If you don't, it's either not going to happen or you're simply going to reach a point where the technology stops working because you can't run enough juice to make these higher level effects happen. That's ultimately the problem. And a good example of this is the black and white mirror stuff. It's a perfectly valid technique. I don't use it because I use elemental equilibrium that fixes all of those problems in people as well, and it fixes it much faster. Whereas I run into countless people who are stuck on the black and white mirror things for like a year and a half. Okay, guys, you're stuck on that next step. Move to the next one. See if you can't find another way to fix this,
Mm.
and then come back and revisit it later on. Because the black and white mirror thing can actually be transformed into a system of generating emotion upon command that's very useful for actors.
Mm.
But you can't do that system until you can pour breathe properly, generate the elements properly, and then generate these states in your mind and anchor them. But I only get to have that conversation, about once every 3 years. So again, it's if someone had a teacher, and I'm not talking a guru, or I'm not talking about somebody they follow around, but even just a coach who can go, hey man, you're fixating a little too much on this, work on this instead.
Mm.
They'd progress much faster and their success rates would be much higher. And again, this goes back to the criticism that I have with a lot of people in the community where I go, they have this obstinate need to be, I'm a lone ship at sea, I'm a master of my own destiny in my grandmother's basement. And I never want to talk to anybody, and I never want to be told how to do things or how to do things better. Okay, go to a powerlifting gym. Yeah, those guys are moving hundreds of kilos around through the press and the squat and the deadlift, right? 90+% of the work is theirs. But even they've got guys watching them for form creep to go, hey man, squat form's off a little bit, your knee's doing this, move it to the left. How would that be any different when learning a meditative technique?
Mm.
Now listen, you're a little bit off on this, try this instead. Yet I bring that up and people just lose their minds. Again, it's progressing through these works rapidly is entirely possible if you understand the material and you've built the body correctly. If you're not willing to listen to other people who've done this work before, and again, this doesn't have to be me, Phil. There are lots of guys out there who've done a lot of work with this stuff. Okay. It's going to take longer because you're going to have to figure things out on your own. And this is true of any endeavor, whether it's banking or carpentry or, baking a loaf of bread. Yeah, in theory, a few people can learn purely from the book, but it usually doesn't work out that way, and they're usually not that great at it. Now, if you can't find anybody, hey, that's a totally different story. Then you're left to your own devices. But again, I can't tell you how many of my own students worked on their own for years, finally ran into me somewhere on the internet or in person or whatever, and then their progression exploded. I tried reading Initiation into Hermetics 3 times on my own, and eventually just ended up leaving it on a park bench every time because it was too wordy. Things weren't very clear. I couldn't figure out, what led to what. I met Mark Rasmus. He walked me through the first book in 8 weeks, and I was off to the races. That never would have happened without him to go, no, this is the technique, just do this. Oh, okay. I still had to do all the work, as does everybody else who has any ability in any of this stuff. But again, a clearer explanation from a human being where you can go, hey, am I supposed to be doing this or this? That's how you learn music. That's how you learn maths. That's how you learn pretty much everything. Whether that's your guru, priest, live in advisor, online coach, guy in the gym you talk to once a week to observe your form. Everybody's got that with every other human endeavor. People just seem to have some weird fascination with, I'm going to do this all on my own.
Mm.
And because of that, very few people actually get that far, which is a shame. But
I
again, I'm
can
a dick and people are going to complain. So, let the hate flow.
We look forward to your comments.
Uh,
Um, yeah. So, okay, now so let's rock into something here. And I think because I discovered Bardon's work through Mark Rasmus as well, through a guy that introduced me to energy healing and all these other things too. But one thing that really kicked the door open for me was basically the Qigong's CLA Sentience training. And like that's like instantaneous magic on demand. Here it is, and then it's like they're rungs on a ladder. It's not like the next rungs all the way up there, and you've got to, oh my god, I got to stretch my arm on a machine or something like that. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
all of your better schools of magic have an exercise like Buildable. All. Everyone I've ever met has something like that. Because clairsentience is the least degraded of your clairsenses. I mean, in many ways, our sense of touch doesn't really exist without its subtle component. So, because of that, that's usually the easiest thing to teach. Now, listen, there are entirely clairvoyant, clairaudient, hell, even clairgustament ways of teaching this material. That said, not many people have that level of development naturally to work with. Clairsentience, absolutely the best way. And so, yeah, the best schools all have that. I had learned that exercise at least half a dozen different times from completely different schools over the years, mostly from Qigong. But in a lot of cases, it was their big secret because
Yeah.
now you didn't have to do the Tai Chi form an hour a day for 3 years to feel the energy. Just did this and was like, oh, okay, fine. So yeah, total, very critical exercise to success using clairsentience as the pathway for learning.
Perfect. Thank you. Right. If a person was to strip IIH right back to a purely enlightenment slash ascension based pathway, what would the general milestones of achievement or proficiency look like? What are the main landmarks to look forward to? Of like basically, hey, I want to go hang out with God or have a connection with a higher mind, universal mind experience.
There are two. One, just do the watching your thoughts, single pointed focus, emptiness exercise with one more step that's left out of the book for reasons I'll never understand. Merge with light. You do that 2 hours a day. I guarantee you within a year, you will have a non-dual light experience, assuming you're basically healthy to begin with. That is also known as Ati Yoga in Tibetan yoga. Now, they got some mantra work in there and some prayers of the Buddha and a bunch of other things. But that's the fundamental technique right there. And I've known a number of people over the years who've achieved enlightenment strictly through that technique.
Mhm.
Now, the problem is, without the body training and all the other work that goes into it, you can't use it to do anything. If you're not going to take that approach, the other approach to take is this. You go out, you gang press the guy through the mother letters till they can generate their own akasha in non-dual light in a subtle form. Then you have them practice rebounding 3 hours a day while running the mother letters, equilibrium, and akasha through themselves and their practice partner. And I guarantee you they will encounter non-dual light somewhere between about day 90 and about day 365. If you just wanted to complete, now that will be an uncontrolled exposure where they'll just be suddenly projected into it. Okay. But it'll happen. If you're just interested in enlightenment, that would be the fastest way to do those two things. One you can do on your own, right? The other, you need a group of people to rebound with. And if you care about them, you're not going to use Akasha on them unless they're also practitioners, because Akasha at that level is very destabilizing.
Hmm.
But those would be the absolute two fastest ways to gang press someone through this. Now, using the rebounding technology, their clairvoyance and clairaudience will open up to one degree or another. And then you can go back and work on those using the other skills in the book. But I only know this because of people and students that I've worked with. You otherwise, if you're mostly training on your own, okay, you're going to need to use IIH as a template, adding in the body training, doing the letters as Kabbalah, and it's going to take upwards of about a year. Now, that's roughly 2 hours of work a day for a year and a half, so it's not that big a tariff, to be completely honest with you. But you're going to have to add the body training into the system so the astral energy can manifest at a high enough level so it gives you something to convert into Akasha and not do light. So that's the bottleneck created by the lack of body training is you can't generate that much energy, so you've got less to convert into these more refined states of matter. And then you get stuck. And again, that's assuming you're not 100 kilograms overweight, you're not in a wheelchair, you don't have some other massive health or drug or, lifestyle problem going on in there as well.
Okay.
Yay!
Hey, it looks good on paper, guys, and then when the rubber meets the road, it's like, oh, really? Yeah, it is. I found that out as a muso because I wanted to aim for high things,
Yep.
and I went, you know what? There's so many different ways of doing this and approaches, and what am I actually seeking to achieve here? That having like you know what, this is what's driving me, and then other things opened up along the way, and that
Right.
kind of brings us to the next combo, which is
Sure.
what are considered to be must-have skills for the long haul for a if you just want to be like a traditional magician, for example, like what are the skills you need?
Okay. Akasha and non-dual light. If you got those two things, you can figure out the rest. If you don't have those, you're going down the path of the sorcerer, where you're using willpower to accomplish things. And because you're immersing yourself into a deeper pool of subtle flora and fauna, that's a contest you eventually lose. Listen, the entities out there, the spirits, they're real. They can heckle you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years on end. If you don't have some ability to make them go away, and you don't have something causing you to track upon your proper line of development, you're going to lose. I mean, one of the bigger things that I became aware of in the last 5 years or so is this concept of the Gregores, which we had a great conversation on the other day. Once you understand how those work and how integral to human existence they are, a lot of people are basically just finger puppets for these things.
Mm.
Now, through sheer force of will, you can break away from something, but without a bunch of these skills, it's very hard to determine when you're being manipulated and when you're not. So this goes back to the issue of, hey, what are the minimum skills a real magician needs? Akasha and non-dual light. I am agnostic as to how you get there. If you're one of those guys who wants to sit down and not emit sexually for a year and run the orbits like a madman 3 to 4 hours a day until you burn a hole in your foot and kick the kundalini off and get your akasha that way, go team. If you've got the mental fortitude for that kind of thing, great. But the process of equilibrium contained in Franz Bardon's IIH is by far the safest, most comfortable way to do that I've found anyway.
Mm. Cool. Okay. All right. So let's say one of the things I really liked what Mark Rasmus talked about is like you can use IIH as a general overlay for a particular path or
Mhm.
venture in your life. So
Sure.
whether you want to be for example, a Reiki practitioner, or you want to be a psychic, or if you want to be a doctor or a plumber or an architect or a builder and these types of things, but it's specifically, what are applications of IIH for? So we'll be specific and go for esoteric practices. So we're talking about people who are operating in the community,
Sure.
some level or another.
Uh, Easy. I mean, listen, because you're getting basic energy skills, you're learning how to work with the elements, you're learning things like ball above head method where you can transmit power into another human being, and you're dealing with opening your clair skills, your clair sentience and clairaudience. IAH will benefit anybody involved in esoterica, period. Even traditional practitioners in a lot of other systems, I've seen benefit from it because it will present skills to them that may not be contained in their system. So it can clean up a lot of sticking points. I have one student who was trained as an exorcist by the church, and he left the church a number of years ago. But he showed up on my doorstep because he said, "Listen, I got all this great training, right? But it was very narrowly focused. And there are all these other things that I can see being a part of this, but I don't know the technology." So I've worked with him, and he's done great, fantastic. So from that standpoint, again, absent body training, IIH is probably the most complete manual of internal power training I've seen anywhere, and it can benefit anybody in esoterica. Now, it can also benefit people in conventional professions as well by giving them more willpower, more energy, a better ability to evaluate theory and application, and allow them to do very, very well. So, some of the better practitioners I know, I can't name here because they run very successful businesses in things like engineering, the legal profession, you name it. And the work of IAH is integral to their success at those things. But there is zero incentive for them to teach publicly or even admit that they do this stuff. And that's probably the most common example of a high level performer I've met to date. A guy you would never assume knows anything about this stuff at all, but this is what allowed them to succeed at what they're doing. At a minimum, mastery of the skills in IAH. Mark Rasmus talks about this a lot, which is why I owe him as much as I do. At a minimum, it will condense that mythical 10,000 hour requirement for proficiency at something down to about 2 or 3,000 hours.
Mm.
So now you have the potential to perform at a fairly high level at a number of things within the course of one lifetime.
Mm.
Even if you got nothing else out of the training other than that, that by itself, if you're someone who's driven to learn how to do things and be good at it, would be worth the price of the tuition. And that often gets left out of this discussion. I mean, this is not me bragging. Okay, this is me reading my bio.
Mm.
I was an officer in the military. I was an advisor to foreign generals. I have a bunch of my Kabbalah stuff. I was part of a successful startup. I have a degree in medicine. I have a degree in history. I have a degree in general engineering. I've spoken a couple different languages at one point in time or another. That level of achievement for somebody who's learned the IH curriculum and applied it to themselves, not terribly uncommon. Go back and read the histories of the greats: Paracelsus, Newton, Einstein, Da Vinci, Marie the Jew, if you can find anything out about her. If you look at the lives of these people, they led remarkable lives.
Mm.
They were highly skilled at a number of different things, and they were often innovators in their own fields. This is not hide in your basement material. This is a tool for rapid personal progression
Mm.
that allows you to be an integral and active part of the world and your communities around you. But if you're stuck on step 2 for 3 years, you're never gonna get there.
And this brings up a really great point, from my own personal experience of, being a musician. I was not a good singer or a player when I first started, right?
Sure, of
And
course.
I had to get good at it, and I did. I got reasonably good, and I'm okay,
Huh,
And but what was happening was is that even when I was performing on stage, my voice was okay, and then I stopped playing and singing for a while there, quite a while. In fact, I don't really do it much nowadays. But when I started doing the training,
right.
all of a sudden, these existing expression pathways that I'd built, my basically capacities for doing things in the physical, like singing,
Sure.
for example, suddenly, man, my voice can do all sorts of fun, cool stuff now. I don't know why. Somebody says to me, "Bro, have you been practicing your singing?" No. Well, it's phenomenally better all of a sudden. And I said, I find it easier to do it. There's a level of ease and proficiency that's just naturally sort of occurring.
Sure.
And the only thing I can petition it to is, this training because, this is, like, wow, I found this thing. It's so good and so fulfilling. And so things that I can already do are suddenly better, existing
Right.
things. And I think that's a real way, like a real acid test for anyone out there that wants to play with this stuff. It's like, you've got to test these things out to be, to grow a level of conviction that what you're doing is going somewhere, you know, like find something that you can do or a bunch of things, and then just note how they, I won't say improve, but how they change is a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, the way I explain it is the training results in an amazing plasticity to your tissue.
Mm.
Right. And by this is both gross tissue in the physical body and the more subtle tissue of the subtle bodies. It'll get you that missing 10 or 20%.
Mhm.
Now, if you just do Tai Chi forms in the backyard and you show up at an MMA fight and you do our stuff, you're going to get schooled. Why? Because that guy didn't have his combos, he didn't have his timing, never got hit, he doesn't have the conditioning. But this kind of training can not only extend your ability to perform in these endeavors quite a bit, but it also results in your being better at them, assuming you have a baseline of skill and conditioning to begin with.
Yep.
I mean, listen, standing on stage with a guitar strapped across your chest, belting it out for 2 hours at a time, that takes real physical effort.
Mhm.
You're under the lights, it's a million degrees underneath there, people are screaming at you, and all kinds of other shenanigans are going on. That
Oh,
takes actual
it was hard, man.
physical effort. Okay, we can make fun of it all we want, but it's true.
Yeah, it
You
is.
know, so that provides a kind of body training by itself. And there are a lot of musicians out there that are good at this stuff. Mystery solved.
Yeah.
So again, that's where if you've got someone who's willing to do the work and they're open-minded enough, a lot of people can benefit from this kind of training. But that doesn't remove the need to actually know how to do something to apply it towards.
Yeah.
And listen, that's true of spirit magic too. Spirit magic largely works through a process of reflection. The spirit looks at you, and based off what it sees, that's how it can communicate with you. If you don't know anything, there's nothing going on there, which is why you can't walk up to a spirit and go, "Hey, show me where the missing gold is." All right. Do you know how to use a metal detector? Do you know how to use a ground penetrating radar? Do you know
Mm.
how to do all of the other things associated with finding the missing gold? I mean, if you go research treasure hunters out there and you get past the phenomenal nature of what they're doing down to the actual work they're doing, Phil, it's ridiculous the lengths these guys go through.
Mhm.
Now, if I could get one of those guys to learn spirit magic, he'd probably be a lot more successful
Mm.
or be able to do it in half the amount of time. But he had to get that whole how you do it part of the equation beaten into him first, to even have that other part of the conversation. And so that's the other issue is that too many people look at this stuff as a kind of cheat code. It's remarkable for what it can do, but it's still a lot of work and there's no getting out of that.
Yeah, and that there's a something I've come across that I feel is akin to what you're talking about when they need something to reflect off. So in dream work, like you will, you'll be in a semi-conscious state, unconscious state, whatever, various levels and degrees of it. But
Sure.
the language that the dream creator, or as I like to call it, the dream poet, will
Right.
present you with, they're going to paint you they're going to try and there's an understanding that's going to be attempted to be conveyed to you through familiar language that they believe you will understand because you'll recognize it and there's a familiarity with the symbols and things.
Sure.
Now that's why you have an interpretation process, and so I kind of feel that's the same. Like I've had interactions with, mm, let's just say I've had some visitors and dreams and that, and the way they communicate is that they look at your existing sort of language set or internal lexicon of understanding, and they
Right.
will use that to basically paint the experience, if not verbal, because it's not often literal if it's just a general dream environment. So I
Right.
really came to understand that when I heard you talking about that, and Mark as well. They
Right.
need something to reflect off, and so you're right. Like the work is worth it. So find something you really love doing, put it in, and then that 10 to 20 that you get. I can attest to that because sometimes there's a proportional scale, like it's exponential growth that you can't really appreciate until you hit it. Like I said, my singing just went from yeah to wow. I mean, I had comments like, "Bro, where you been to doing some you're doing some hardcore training? Have you been to boot camp?" Nope.
Right. Right. Yeah. And, this, an adjunct to that, this is the reason why drug use is so damaging. Drug use in general causes brain damage, a restructuring of the brain that randomizes access to information. Now, a not very bright person will consider this to be creativity because they're making these connections they never made before, right? But they're not connections built off of an actual relationship between things. It's just completely random data getting picked up by wires that are broken and have now done this to kludge themselves back together. It's where a lot of conspiracy theory stuff comes from because all of these random connections to the person experiencing it look like sense. When in reality, no, it's just a bunch of garbage. It's garbage in, garbage out. And so if you don't have that damage in your system, okay, and you do these techniques, you get wonderful things coming out of it. because those connections are properly formed and you're forming all these corollaries and understanding things and your body's working better and all this other kind of business. But if you mix narcotics into this, you're just running more juice through already compromised circuitry,
Mhm.
which is why there's a tendency of people who mix esoteric and drug use to just go completely insane. And they usually get into conspiracy theories and other weird things for years beforehand. So people know me, they know my habits. You know, it's easy for me to be critical of something that I don't do myself because I don't get involved with that stuff. But that's the problem ultimately with all of this is you're running more juice through the circuit board.
Mm.
And if the body's structured for that, you get a great benefit from it. If the body's not structured for that, it will bottleneck until it breaks you. But most people are smart enough to quit before that happens altogether. Yay.
Yeah. And I think too that the nature of these practices is that there's a self-correcting element in it. And so you tend to start making better decisions because you're, for starters, especially in the early training when you're separating yourself from your thoughts, you're not being driven by old patterns. And because you're applying a refinement process to just how information starts to appear in your field, and you're essentially liberating yourself from external influences. So you are, in Reiki, we talk about, finding the true self. It's like a pocketbook version in some
Right.
cases of this process. It's like, well, who would you be without all the influences from your life? What would a genuine expression of you be? And, when you are on some kind of stimulant, you essentially have an aberrant or an exaggerated version or expression of yourself coming through. I mean, I've noticed this being a musician playing on stage and watching basically everyone get drunk, and everyone's fine at the beginning of the night having a good time, and then towards the end it's like, it's a degeneration into like a really bizarre kind of yeah, behavior, and it was quite difficult. And it was one of the things that kind of put me off in the end, to be honest, especially once I started getting into meditation, because it was just so well, it was just unenjoyable. But there was a background static that was building up too. But hey, look, no problems here, man. If you like to go out and party, have a good time, man, more power to you, because those people are going to go home and have babies, and don't stop having babies. And always
Um,
take, yeah.
what I'll say about all that is what you're describing is sometimes referred to as the process of ennoblement.
Of a what?
Ennoblement.
Sorry,
The process of ennoblement, where you get rid of all your
ennobled.
bad habits.
Yeah.
The mechanism behind that is actually clairsentience based. You become so sensitive to your environment and what you're putting into yourself and what you're doing with yourself that you quit going to places where things make you feel bad. You quit doing things that make you feel bad.
Mm.
And so it's an interesting thing where, somebody goes through this process, few years, they've lost all their bad habits. They're very boring. All they do is take care of their job, take care of their family, and practice like a demon. Right.
Yeah.
But they didn't do it because they wanted to be nice to other people.
Yeah.
They did it because that static you were describing
Yeah.
was just too irritating.
Yeah. It's
And
like you're resensitizing yourself, eh?
well, I had this one student who shall remain nameless for obvious reasons, who had a real sex addiction problem. This guy at a certain point in his life was visiting prostitutes like 3 times a day. Don't ask me how he paid for it, but okay.
Damn.
Got into practice, lost all those bad habits, quit doing all that stuff. One day he's going for a run in a developing country where prostitution is very common. Just the process of running past the brothel made him feel physically uncomfortable.
Mm. Yeah.
So
Wow.
it's
That's
great. He fixed his problems. He wasn't doing stupid stuff anymore, right? Wasn't wasting his time in that environment. But he became so sensitive, he couldn't even run past the place.
yeah. Yeah.
So, again, but this is easy to dismiss as delusion
Mm.
if you haven't built that sensitivity
Mm.
to these things. And so, body training again is where I've seen people get the most bang for their buck really quickly.
Okay, cool. So Now let's get to some juicy stuff here because I think that one of the things that is very attractive for people is this idea of being able to experience a very clearly delineated set of energetic frequency experiences.
Mm.
And so, you've penned an excellent PDF, which you've somehow managed to lose on the website because I went looking for it,
Sure.
and it's a really great thing, and I'm looking forward to the remastered version of it, and that is the 11 energies.
Mm.
And I have to say, like when you categorize it like that, like being a Reiki practitioner or that, you generally just talk about the one key or the one chi and things like that. Well, it turns out there's a bit of a strata, and even those detectable differences or cleanly differentiated sort of energy signatures are really just like milestones on a big spectrum. And so, yeah, let's hear about this, man, because this is really cool.
This is really the genius part of what Bardon did with IIH involving the elements and later on with Key the Truth. He gave you a roadmap of what these things do. He gave you a roadmap on how to identify them. And even more so, he said, hey, depending upon what level of reality you generate this at, this is the effect you're going to get. I mean, Phil, this is just remarkable work that made everything that I do and a lot of other people out there practical. And the fact that it's not more popular, because again, this tuning fork technology, for lack of a better word, is easily applicable to any number of things: martial arts, sports performance, Reiki, hands off healing, artistry, engineering, you name it. But getting people to the point where they're open to that idea is really hard. And let's have this conversation all the time. Some Dilbert performer or athlete will talk about the energy in a crowd, right? And everybody's okay with that. But the second I go, yeah, that's true. And oh, by the way, you can work with that actively, they just
Hmm.
completely lose their minds
Yeah.
because they're not open to that idea. And this is where, again, reality doesn't change, but your beliefs impact how you perceive reality and therefore how you can work with it. So, like we talked about the other day, in the School of Hermetics, I'm a part of, you got the vital, you got the astral, you got the mental, you got the akashic, and you've got non-dual light. Okay. If you're talking to a classically Western person from the 20th or 24th century, they believe in the physical, right? We're really good at that, materialism. They believe in this concept of mind. You've got a mind. And if
Hmm.
they're religious on a certain level, they'll believe in non-dual light. But they're leaving out that astral sensation energetic realm in akasha.
Hmm.
So it's hard for them to bridge between these three because they're missing these two.
Yeah, they're like missing rungs on a ladder almost, aren't they?
Exactly. So psychology, right?
Mm.
You read books on psychology and psychiatry, they're clearly mixing phenomenon from the energetic and mental realms,
Mm.
but they're only addressing it from the status of mind.
Well, he's not pulling the finger at the audience either. I just want to say
Right.
that.
So because of that, the technology they employ doesn't work that well
Hmm.
because they don't believe in the energetic. Okay, now this got us materialism in the Industrial Revolution and chemistry and surgery and all that other, and steel. Great, go team. But understanding how all of these things interact,
Hmm.
because the training technology used at each level of reality is distinct. Physical, pick up the weight, put the weight down. Astral, manipulate your senses, use the breath. Mental, focus and relaxation.
Yep.
Akasha, merging those three things into a state of equilibrium where you experience the nothingness out of which everything springs. Bridge over that nothingness into non dual light.
Hmm.
The technology used at each level of reality is distinctly different. Now, by stacking those, you can move from one to the other or vice versa. But if you leave two of those three levels of reality out, getting from here to here gets really hard.
Hmm.
the example I like to use is you go to the gym, right? You can press 135 pounds, 245, 220 kilogram plates on the bar. Okay. If you go and put another 220 kilogram plates on the bar for 4 20 kilogram plates, that guy who can normally press 2 plates can't press the 4 unless he's just genetically lucky or really digs deep and blah, 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 blah. It's too big a jump.
Yeah.
But if you take that same guy who can press 2 plates, and then you use the smaller plates over a period of 8, 10, 12, 16, 20 weeks, then he can press the 4.
Hmm.
It's much more manageable. And so that's training those different levels of reality and all the 60 skills and all the stuff in IIH and all the stuff you need to learn to engage that tuning fork system with energetic signatures that we talk about in Bardon's Kabbalah and the Elements. That's the hard part. So maybe I
Hmm.
digressed a little bit, but that's kind of how I do it.
Okay. Well, that was 5 out of the 11. Okay. And then,
Okay.
of course, we've got, we have this electric and magnetic fluids, which I'm seeing that relates to the lines of force.
The easiest way to train this is through body training. The electric and magnetic lines of force is the easiest way to generate that magnetic and electric sensation.
Hmm.
So again, by using a physical technique, we're bridging into the astral. Now that's going to give you more energy at the astral level to convert into the mental when you mentally engage that expansion or contraction sensation
Hmm.
of the mind, which then gives you more energy at the mental level to neutralize those two, achieve equilibrium, and engage the Akashic, which then gives you more Akashic force to bridge the gap to non-dual light.
Hmm.
So this is the reason why it's technically possible to get from the purely mental to the non-dual light level. But frequently people don't have enough underlying energy, for lack of a better term, to convert up that chain.
Mhm.
So by doing the body training, I think you get more of that. Everything else works better.
Cool. Okay. So, and then of course, so that's roughly 7, and now we have the remaining 4, which we would obviously be the 4 elements,
Mhm.
and which are experiential, especially at the astral level, and then they're more like like an esoteric psychological categorization system across the board, because they're the common denominator amongst the various worlds or realms of existence or planes of existence: vital,
Right.
astral, mental, akashic, non-dual light. But so these 4 elements of the astral body. I'd love to hear a little bit of elaboration on that, if you could, please, sir.
Sure. Okay. So, you've got fire, air, water, earth, SCH, umlaut A. Okay. The reason why training this is so effective is you generate a lot of astral energy working with these things very quickly. That sense of perception, what we call energy flow, a better term. But then something curious happens. In theory, and I've had students pull this off with quite a bit of effort, you can reach that equilibrium point just using electric and magnetic.
Mm.
But it's hard to do because the forces have to be equally strong to do that, and it's really tough to do.
Yeah.
Most men are more electric by nature and less magnetic, women the other way around. What's interesting about working with the elements is now you're dealing with a four-sided kind of cross,
Yeah.
okay? Quadrupolar magnet. It's much easier to get that thing to balance using 4 elements than it is using electric and magnetic. So because of that, and because you're generating all this energy through breath and concentration and focus and all this other kind of business, breaking through to equilibrium and therefore generating your own akasha becomes much easier as well. So as far as I can tell, the elements represent a fundamental underpinning of reality. Okay. But practically, the 4 elements make it much easier to establish equilibrium and get to akasha, which is why we spend so much time training.
Mm.
And there's also a feedback loop between the elements where they want to balance out. Whereas with electric and magnetic, you really don't get that as much. They act in opposition to each other. So it ends up being a kind of weird tug of war thing versus getting this four-sided sheet of paper, right, to just balance.
Mm.
Then you get equilibrium, then you get akasha, then you're off to the races.
I'd love to hear what your take on this equilibrium is.
It's
Sometimes referred to as, sorry. Yep.
at its most base level. It's a balancing of the elements within the body. That's it. And it doesn't have to be precisely on point because you've really only got two elements, fire and water. Air is the middle point between the two, and earth is the combination of all three. So they're going to aim towards balance. And particularly when you work with earth element, man, it is this step right below akasha. Everything gets super quiet. Everything gets super still because it's compacting those three other elements that move around. And when that happens, equilibrium's almost a foregone conclusion. Now, how strong in an individual element someone is and all that kind of thing, that's a separate thing related to training and physical potential and all that other kind of business. But that's the reason why working with the elements as Kabbalah can result in equilibrium so quickly. I mean, I've had guys do it in 6 weeks. It's scary. That then allows you to contact those higher levels of reality. Because here's the thing. Get most people alone in a quiet place. There's no cell phones on. Nobody's looking at them. Nobody's recording anything. You get them relaxed. Most people will have experienced things like akasha and non-dual light at some point during their life. Now, it was purely accidental, and they don't know how they got there. So by training those bottom three levels of reality, vital, astral, mental, and working with the elements, that allows us to replicate that akashic and later on non-dual force predictably. It gives you a method to get there. And that's when the magic kicks off. Because, listen, everybody's heard the story of the grandmother who picked up the car to save her grandkid, right? Grandma couldn't go into a powerlifting gym and pull that off Monday through Friday. But everything lined up exactly the right way, energetically, and she made it happen. But that was an accident, or that was just an incident. When you can work with these things consciously, you can get them to line up when you want them to. And I don't think there's a better definition of magic than that.
Hmm. Is it like a you've kind of got these aspects of yourself, like these three levels that are sort of like naughty kids or children, and they sort of need to be sort of schooled or trained, or they've got a they're just doing their thing. And I mean, when before you start this process, you may not even be aware of these three worlds. I mean, I know in a lot of sort of spiritual circles, there's a lot of talk about chakras and these types of things, but those are a little bit more nebulous. You can kind of
Sure.
feel things, I guess, but this three body approach to equilibrium, like especially astral, the thing which stands out for me is in the Bardon work, is
Mhm.
that they're very tangible and relatable straight off the bat,
Right.
you know, and so it makes it quite accessible. And so I'm think my assumption is you're basically like as Bardon says, you're schooling these three aspects of yourself to
Sure.
eliminate noise, to straighten the pipe, so that you have a much cleaner signal and cleaner access to these more true parts of yourself. I would say, these, because the noise is essentially a form of influence or static that
Sure.
was that you encountered, and you can noisy up the different parts of your body through behaviors and actions and how you engage things.
Right. Completely true. Completely accurate. The main thing is the reason why we train the first three levels of reality, vital, material, astral, and mental, so much is even if you're not aware of it, these are states of awareness people go through every day. Bang, I kicked the chair, my toe hurts. Material. Oh, I love my child. Ah, the emotion of loving my child. Astral. Oh, I have to file my taxes. A mental concept. There's no physical representation. So these three levels of reality people deal with all the time. The other two they deal with by exception, usually under duress. So they don't really have any knowledge of how to engage those. But God gave us a tremendous gift. By working with these three, you can learn to work with the other two. And that's really what Bardon's first book is about. It's just the technology to work on this end of the equation is lacking in the book.
Yeah, yeah. I've got to say, like, I've been doing these practices, and I just realized that when I don't do physical work, I find myself being far more taxed afterwards doing these other works. And it's like, man, you need an even spread. You want to round out the practice. And I may have mentioned this in the previous video. It's like when you've got a vehicle. You don't just go and throw a supercharged V8 engine into a Mini. If
Sure.
you haven't got the brakes and the chassis all done up, you basically got an overpowered like train wreck on your hands.
Right.
And so yeah, I think that's really cool. And like you said, back in the day, I think this is such an important point. You brought it up before, is like when this material was put together and being taught, the world was a very different place. It was a different geographic location. There was a different zeitgeist in general. People were far more physical. Life was harder. We lived much more sedentary type lifestyles for the large part. And so, some things that were just like a given weren't included in the book. And
Even something like the mirror work, right? Rural Germany and rural Czech Republic during that time period, those are very critical cultures. So you knew what your bad points were. Why?
yeah,
Because people told you all the time. You're fat, you're lazy, you're this, you're that, you're whatever, you're whatever. And yeah, that can be abusive, fair enough. But we're living in an environment where kids get participation trophies for sports. Instead of being told, no, you're not any good at it, get better at it,
yeah,
fix your problem.
yeah,
Okay, so black and white mirrors. I've seen people basically delude themselves into brainwashing themselves using this stuff because they're working on what they think their negative aspects are, not what they actually are. And they end up tweaking their system out. It's a weird thing. And I bring this up to people who completely lose their minds. Human beings are terrible observers of their own behavior. We're good observers of other people's behavior,
mm,
but we're terrible at observing our own behavior. So, how are you going to accurately evaluate your black and white mirrors when you live in a society that's never told you you're bad at something?
yeah. We have there's an old saying, some societies are too polite to be honest, and some are too honest to be polite. And
Right.
we have that here because it's a very mixed cultural sort of like demographic here in New Zealand,
Sure.
and so you get a lot of like people who don't like to. Some things are not said; they're not polite to speak about in public, and then you get like a brash European come in, and they're just like, no, this that just so straight up, it's so abrupt and abrasive, but it's like working with in the trades and that, and just having all these international mechanics come over and like hard work and salt of the earth buggers, man, they just say it as they see it. And that's a great way to sort of like get rid of that problem, because you're right, that you want to be avoiding all that kind of like comfortable
Right.
delusion as much as possible.
And this is where body training is very valuable because Henry Rollins, the rock star, said it best. 100 pounds on the ground is 100 pounds. It's going to kick you the real deal. You can either move that 100 pounds or you can't.
Yeah,
No amount of thought is going to make that move if you can't physically do it. And so, yeah, it's the reason why, learning to lift weights, doing the Olympic lifts or barbell training or whatever helps a lot of people out because not only does it build a lot of those connections in the body, you quickly have to become realistic regarding what you are actually capable of doing.
mm,
And that in turn translates over to other things.
mm,
Yeah, listen, there are lots of things I look back fondly on my military service with that I would love to go do again. Still, I'm in my 50s. I'm an old, fat, beat up man. I can't do those things anymore. I have the fond memories of them. Great. But I'm under no illusion that I'm going to magically go do that kind of work. Throw 95 pounds on my back and go walk 15 kilometers. Be lucky if I made it 500 meters at this point. That's just not going to happen. And even if I lost, 30 kilograms of weight, worked out like a fiend and did the conditioning, okay, maybe I could move the 15 kilometers with that kind of weight on me. But I'm going to be a lot slower than I was because I'm in my 50s. I'm not in my 20s. But how many people out there, have deluded themselves into thinking they're still capable of doing things that they used to be able to, or worse yet, have deluded themselves into thinking they can't do something.
So
Unless,
with that,
yeah.
sorry, I was just going to say, with that in mind, how accessible is the outcomes of IIH for a full age range? Like there's the various levels of uh, l- realistic sort of input based on your physical structure and your throughout the years. Is it accessible largely to a large number of people?
If you're under your mid 20s, you're not going to have the focus for the most part needed. If you're much over your early to mid 50s and you don't already have a background in this stuff, you probably lack the physicality to generate enough energy to make it work. Now, there are going to be exceptions to this. One of the stars of the movie Ghostbusters, the black gentleman, he's 78. If you've seen pictures of him, oh my God,
Oh, yeah, Ernie Hudson. Yeah, yeah.
Ernie Hudson. Yeah, if he looks over 52 to most people, I'd be amazed.
Mm.
But again, he's an outlier. The best example of this I ever saw is a high school teacher of mine's wife. She's in her 70s. She looks to be maybe in her early 50s. Her father, who is 108, drove to the airport in his own car to pick her up.
Hmm.
Her mother's 104.
Wow.
She's from a family of genetic outliers.
Yeah, right.
No diet you or I are going to follow is going to make us live that long. People who live over 100 in Western society are about 2 to 3 in 1,000. It's purely a genetic level event. Now, technology can change that, okay? But just like the kid in high school we all knew, who went on to a great career in athletics, who could leap 1 meter straight up from a standstill, he was born with that. That guy didn't do anything to build that ability. He just got lucky in the gene Olympics and having the right parents to have this amazing amount of natural explosive strength. So, yes, there are outliers. I'm sure there are guys in their 60s who are perfectly well developed, never been seriously injured a day in their life, in awesome shape, and look like they're 40, with no background in this stuff, who could absolutely succeed. But generally speaking, 25 to 55 as your starting point works about best.
Mm.
And if you're from a traditional company, traditional society, where you got a teacher who can and is empowered to beat you like a monkey with a stick, yeah, you could train as a child and really achieve really good things. But the kind of abuse that goes into that to make a kid pay attention and focus and do physically uncomfortable things hours a day, that's not Western civilization today. You get reported to the authorities and
Yeah, yeah.
carted off for child abuse. And I say that because I know that the origin stories of some older, more traditional practitioners from, particularly from Asia, you know, kid being locked in his shed all day long for 7 weeks at a time. And every time he lost his focus, the teacher would come by and throw rocks at the shed and scare the crap out of the kid. Another guy, when he was like 9 years old, they had him dig a pit in the ground and burn incense in it and have him sit in the pit meditating all day long. And they wouldn't feed him and they'd scream and yell at him if he didn't do it. So, yeah, there's a way to train that stuff when you're younger, but it takes an older person making you do it in what we would generally consider to be an abusive manner. So, for the most part, mid 20s to mid 50s.
Sweet. Thank you. Um, okay, so obviously, there's the driving force to want to do this,
Mhm.
and there's a momentum that can be harvested from the initial kind of excitement, the honeymoon period. And there's ways of nourishing that, and there's ways of recapturing that too. Like I've had to do that over the years as well, like with various things. Sometimes the romance dies a little bit, the magic disappears, and
Sure.
and I have to say too that as the doors start to open and your worldview changes, you know, it's like somebody comes out and tells you that Santa's not real and stuff like that. Like you start
Sure.
to get a real accurate view of reality, or an increasingly accurate view, or there's comprehension capacities that open up, and you're like, oh man, put me back in, man. Put me back in. But as far as the admin goes, or just even how to get the most out of your time investment. So one thing I've put here is like mapping out the process as a
Mhm.
starting point. Mark Rasmus is big on this, talks about mind mapping, and then obviously also having a goal in mind, like what am I going to do with this thing, or am I just doing it just because I don't know why, like so.
Right.
What do you think are some great sort of like things to start off with straight out of the gate to sort of like keep you on track and help to keep that process,
Sure.
like there's a logical base for what you're doing so you can see
Right.
where it's going, etc.
Really, two things. One, you have to have a reason to do it. And I've never met anybody who did this stuff because they wanted to find God. They did it because they had a problem that conventional technology couldn't solve. That's one. So you got to have a reason to be there. I can't give that to somebody. They have to find that on their own. It's usually for a health reason, to be completely honest. Two, you need to understand what techniques you're going to train. And this is true of any system. It's the Japanese and the martial arts are great because you go on the first day to the dojo and they give you a book with all the techniques you're going to learn. Okay, great. You need to do a similar thing with this. So mind mapping, 60 skills curriculum, taking everything in IIH and writing out the individual steps, you know what they are, works well too. Then you have to make this routine. And the easiest way I've seen this to do is to have people block off 2 hours in a day, usually in the morning before life gets started and events intervene, and come hell or high water, just like religion on every Sunday morning, those 2 hours you go practice, period. Doesn't matter if you feel good, doesn't matter if you feel bad, doesn't matter if you're excited or not. You're making the donuts, and this is what you do for those 2 hours. I've seen people finish the whole curriculum in a year and a half that way. You want to spend more time, you can do it faster. But that's kind of the minimum that I've seen. At 120 minutes. We're all right. It's 4:30 in the morning. I got to get the kids ready at 6:30. Here we go.
Hmm.
This isn't sexy, but it's also how everything else works. You want to be a good musician, you got to get practice in, and not
Yeah.
noodling, just jamming out the scales and the chords and all that other kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Doing your finger techniques. The fitness influencer guys, brother, they're in the gym every day at the same time doing their thing for 2 hours. And then they'll monkey around with media to do cool stuff to film. But they are religious about what they do and what they eat and when they do it. And that's true of anything. You want to get your degree in engineering? All right, you go to the classes, but between 4:30 and 7:30 at night every night for those 4 years you're studying because that's what it takes to do those things.
Hmm.
So that's it. There's no real secret sauce. It's just
Yeah.
have a reason for what you're doing, map out what you're going to practice, and be very explicit about that.
Hmm.
And then set up the time in which you have to do this. And if you're older, it gets harder because you got more demands on your time and things going on. And then you just pound away. And it's that grind that gets you the success. And that's it. I mean, it's not complicated. But ultimately you have to have a reason for doing this.
Hmm.
And if you lack a reason, you're going to quit.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Now here we have the front cover of the book of Initiation into Hermetics,
Sure.
and obviously, like we covered in the KDQ video, that there's a reason for these images to
Right.
present information in a pictorial fashion. It's an educational diagram of sorts.
Sure.
And so this is quite different to the other one in that it's for me it sort of speaks of the process and also of like a map of the various worlds. I'm just wondering if you could provide a little bit of feedback on how you view this diagram.
Sure. Okay. You got physical at the bottom. You got astral in the middle. You got mental at the top. You got the sun and the moon, opposing forces astrologically, planetary. You got the four elements, breathing into Akasha with the Om.
Cool,
That's it.
sweet. That's it. So guys, there's value in exploring, symbolism provided in various texts, and this is definitely no exception. Now, before we finish up, Bob, I wanted to just say, what is the 60 skills approach when it comes to uh, taking people through the process? Because I know that it's largely your work is, or the work is, it's inspired by the book, but it's also like you've made some changes and some modifications for
Sure.
your own and for good reason too. And I'd love to just hear a little bit about how you roll, bro.
Right. It's basically Bardon's work from IIH with the addition of body training. And it's staged. Now, there's two ways you can do it. You can go from one technique to the next, meeting the required metrics in the system. And I'm explicit about what those are, so there's no confusion. I don't bring up the issue of mastery. I just go, hey, you have to do this for 5 or 10 minutes without interruption. Fair enough. Or you can use the Mala method where you do one technique after another for a set amount of time, working through the whole series a couple times a day. Either one of those work. Generally, what I found though is most of my students, by the time they come to me, have been practicing for a decade or longer. And so, really, they're using the curriculum from IIH in my work to fill in the holes in their training.
Mm.
That's probably 90%. I have had a couple students start from zero and they've done great, but they all gave it a good 2 hours a day, pretty much. Generally working from one technique to the next and then revisiting things as they needed to. But that's it. Again, there's no real secret sauce. It's just have a reason, have a curriculum, and give it the time, and everything kind of works.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to say a big thank you once again, sir. It's always a pleasure.
Of course.
And we'll call it there, and I'll post this up. But thank you once again, everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope everyone took some value from this. And obviously, you can reach Bob at
www.60skills.com. You can hear all about it. All my coursework's on Perseus, and we just dropped the new Planetary Kabbalah course today in case you'd be interested in that. So come check it all out, guys. Thank you very
excited.
much, Phil.
Always a pleasure, sir. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for listening and watching and participating. Please drop a comment, like, share, all that sort of good stuff. Check out Bob's YouTube channel. Man, that's generous as generous.
Thank you.
So, stay well, everyone. And we might see you again soon.
Bye-bye.